All right. Mo, you want to take it away?
Now that everyone's had time to do the Section 11 exercise, does anyone have anything they want to show?
Does any students want to show anything or ask any questions? What did we think of exercise 11?
I personally thought it was all right. I wasn't able to finish doing all of the different describe blocks, but it was pretty fun writing like the custom matchers and like actually doing like that. It felt like development work, just like trying to write the resource properly and like drop it into the shell to like help debug and all that stuff. So that's my take at least.
Thanks, Emily.
Yeah, and there is another method of being able to actually debug things more interactively, which is pry. Basically, pry is a Ruby debugger that allows you to basically put a breakpoint in your code and kind of walk through things and give you the real-time running environment to where you executed your code. So if you're executing an InSpec profile against a remote host and something isn't working, you can actually just throw a Ruby pry command in the middle of your control and it'll stop right there. And you can then go inspect to see what your code's doing and making sure that it's doing what you expect it to be doing. We found it very, very useful. For some strange corner cases. So just like Deep said, going into the shell and all that, take that one more level and now you have an active testing environment. Cool. All right. Well, do we want to move on to the next section?
So section 8 that we skipped over yesterday is more of a high-level example to show you how current resources are built and show you a couple of examples of some of their functionalities. And then right after we're done with this, we'll get into the next exercise in section 12. So for example, we are looking at the bridge resource, which is part of the built-in resources in InSpec. As you can see, it's built normally as we've seen before, where it has the class, the name, the supports, description, and examples. But then you'll also notice one thing right here is it actually has a operating system check, where it can check what type of OS are we on, Linux or Windows. And then if we actually scroll down here, we can actually see it has a class called Linux Bridge over here and a class called Windows Bridge, which has different functionality based on the type of operating system it's on. And so that's just to get you an idea of how some of the resources are built, because this is something that Aaron had touched upon yesterday. One of the benefits of having a resource isn't just to be able to reduce the functionality, it's also to make it one resource to be able to utilize same functionality across operating systems. Doesn't matter the method that it takes to do that operation, this is what the resource's power is to do. It'll go ahead and do the correct operations until it gets to the desired result. Scrolling down, we can look at the command resource, which is one of the most widely used resources in InSpec. It has supports for both Unix and Windows. It gives you examples of how it's used. You can see it's still being initialized the same way. It has all its functionality methods. And then it even has some checks based on what type of operating system it's in. Scrolling down through to the Nginx resource. Once more, built the same way, supports, we have the examples, we have the initialize method, we have some of the functionality methods, and then we actually also see over here the private methods. So this is over here, what it's doing is it's just parsing the data in specific ways to then be utilized up top by the actual public methods. That was another thing that we had touched upon before. Now the file resource similarly also has a Unix file permission and a Windows file permission, so it'll have two different types of functionality as we've seen. We have the examples, the supports, the initialize method, all the functionality methods. And then what's kind of special about how this one works is actually we also have a directory resource, which I'm going to go down to. It's the next resource we show. And if you look at the directory resource, it's actually quite small, because what the directory resource actually does is it inherits the full file resource to be used. So the directory resource has all the same functionality as the file resource. And then we'll look at the Etsy hosts. We'll go ahead, same way it's built, but then you'll also notice it utilizes the filter tables. And you have its functionality methods. And then finally, the Docker, similarly built, but you'll see for every type of service that Docker can perform, it has its own filter table. So for Docker containers, there's the filter table for that. For the Docker images, it has its own filter tables. For the Docker plugin, as well as the Docker service. And then it utilizes that within the actual Docker resource down at the bottom. And then you have all the functionality methods that parse each and every one of those filter tables. And so those were just a couple of resources that we wanted to highlight on, just to show off some of the functionality that you've learned in the course, and you can see how they're actually utilized in these resources themselves.
Now, the other thing I wanted to touch on, Mo, a little bit is as we were looking through this code, you know, when you're looking at some of the, excuse me, the initializer methods and things like that, you might notice that there's these things called attribute reader and basically attribute reader commands at the top of the class. I think that was like down in the second example. Yeah. Where this is taking one of those class variables that is defined, like conf path or, user or group, or basically anything that's defined in the resource itself. But I actually want to expose that data to the end user, because right now the only thing that InSpec exposes without that declaration there is the public methods. So if I want to expose some of that data that's in the class, so a good example of this is if in a conf resource it actually has to calculate the path where it found the conf file and things like that. Actually exposing that as a part of the resource interface is useful, because then I can say, hey, resource.conf path, and it'll return me a string of the file path that it calculated for me, or where that is, or the user or the group. So, consider sometimes as you're starting to look at developing your resources, what other data elements besides functions that you might want to expose, just for, some convenience of programmatics, right? Things like the params, which is the raw data structure that most resources kind of calculate. We kind of had a standard practice of exposing params and, being able to see the raw data behind the resource. And all that kind of thing for whatever we might use it for. So, and then, Roni does this very commonly with like a lot of the AWS resources. We expose particular pieces of data, and that kind of thing.
All right, so moving on to section 12 then. This is going to be similar to how we did the first developer class, where our first day was just learning the concepts, and then the second day was we let you on your own to develop as many profiles as you wanted. In today's class, what we're going to be doing is developing as many resources as you want. Now, we have a couple suggested ones if you'd like to go ahead and work on them, as well as listing out what type of functionality they can have. So you can use this as a guide if you want. You can elaborate more on what we have here, or if you have your own type of resource that you'd like to build or are interested in, feel free to branch off and work on that as well. If you go ahead and go into your environment and then open up your day 2, you'll see that you have an instruction folder. And inside of the instruction folder, there is a box that is assigned to you, similarly to how we did the first class. Just replace the last 2 numbers right here with whatever your student ID is. So if your student ID is 1, your IP address would be 101. If you're student 20, this would be 120. And so you have your own box that you can go ahead and SSH into, configure it as you need to be able to test. And this is what we will be working on for a majority of the day today. All right. If there are no questions, then go ahead and feel free to get started. At any point in time, if you're having any issues, let us know, and we can try and work it through it. And other than that, at the end of it all, if we can get some show and tell to see what type of progress you've made, what type of resources you've built, we can go ahead and review those. Thank you.
And if the students could just put into chat kind of which part you're working on, just to give us an idea, that would be appreciated.
Mo, I got a quick question. Should there be a Docker container on our instances or a Docker image or anything?
What I did just to have like raw data was that I started one to just like have something running in the background. I can put in the command that I used into the chat.
Yeah, there's not one pre-installed, but you do have SSH capability into your own box, so feel free to install and configure it as you need for your tests.
Yeah, so I just SSH into the box and I ran that command so as to just provide, any amount of data. Could I share my screen again in order to get some debugging help? I'm trying to do this fetch data properly, but it seems to be collecting the data and putting it into like the dictionary, the hash or whatever. But by the time it actually actually runs, when I try to do like the Docker entries, it's saying something about there's no new method being defined on the nil class based off of something being wrong in the install filters method.
Does the last line truly return the output? Is it an array of hashes? The output dot push.
Yeah, I mean I can verify.
This would be a great use of pry.
Wait. Why do you have the line output on there? It's outside the method, right? Is it outside the method?
It should not be outside the method.
Okay, maybe. Okay.
Right.
Let's see.
This would be a great use of pry, don't you think, Ronnie?
I'm not a big fan of pry as you are, Aaron. But yeah, can you show what's it bringing out?
Can I show what?
Can you print it out? Like execute it?
Yeah, it's right there. So that's the output. Because here we have the.
Don't you have to set the columns? You haven't set the columns.
Is that required?
Yes, I believe so.
Oh, okay. I was just trying to get like this fetch data thing to work at all. So, okay. So it needs columns. Okay.
Yeah, but you don't need the matchers or anything like that. But I believe you need the columns. We'll try it out. Maybe that could be it.
Okay.
I haven't tried it without the columns, so I could be wrong.
All right. I'll do that and then hit you guys back up if it don't work.
Okay, let me know. Thanks.
Does every key in the dictionary need a corresponding column, or do I just need like however many columns that I need to actually extract out of the data.
That's a good question. Try it out. I don't think I ever tried it without covering all the big fields. But Aaron, maybe you know the answer.
Well, I know the answer is written down if we take a look at the documentation for filter tables. So on Deep, if you look at the InSpec GitHub and go under the dev docs, you should be able to find the documentation for filter table. If you want to share your screen again. No, it's in the code base.
That's in the code base? Like, oh, okay, so the dev docs? Okay. Filter table internals?
Yes. Everything you ever wanted to know about filter table.
It doesn't say anything about if they're all required, huh?
Oh, I mean, in their example right here, they have this data set that has ID, name, and color, but they're only adding a property for names.
Well, we're talking about column, not property.
I mean, but it said that all the columns are just a wrapper for property. Or at least it is right now. All right. Okay. Yeah. So let me look around with that. Thanks for the heads up.
As you know, on Deep, I'm a big fan of reading the documentation.
You're saying that the real thing to do isn't just, bang your head against the wall for forever and hope eventually you come upon the right set of characters to make it, whatever you want to have happen?
No, because I have to pay for that. So
Yeah. So in my test class, when I removed all the columns, I got the same error you did. I'm deep with the new.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, and you just need at least one column registered.
I'm surprised they didn't make a root default column.
Okay, I kind of got it working, but still not working properly. So when I put in raw data, it's finally able to actually get the output properly. But if I try to, for example, look at that names attribute, which should be whatever Docker randomly made, it's returning nil for some reason.
The trivial issue on the register column, the field should not be a symbol because I don't think it's a symbol.
I mean, I copied it over from here where it did the symbol.
Yeah.
I can change it to
it's a different hash. On the example, it is actually no, not over there at the field, I believe. Try putting it in quotes.
Like that?
Yeah, try that. There you
go. Okay.
So in the example, there are actually symbols. That is a form of symbolic representation of the array of hashes.
I mean, so why did it work in this example, but it didn't work?
It is a symbol on the example. Go back to the example, Andy. So what you see in name : Sarah, that is a symbol base.
Oh, okay. I get it. But this is a string to string, but that's a symbol to string. Okay.
That's right.
All right, thank you.
No problem.
So here, the first question that I have is, what does it mean by repo? As far as I'm aware, it never actually tells you like the repo, for like the container.
So if you don't have any, so if there was a repo, you would see a slash and a word before it, right? That would be a repo.
Okay, so like I guess like if it wasn't like, if I was using a like an image that wasn't one of like the official Docker images, so it actually has like a namespace and everything. Is that what you meant by repo?
No, let me send you an example. So this is the image. When I put in chat, that's the image for chef InSpec. Here, chef is a repo, and InSpec is an image.
Okay.
So I think what most intended is maybe split it by the /.
Okay.
Is that right, Mo? So yeah, maybe you can just go with that. Split it by the /, and what comes before is a repo.
Okay. So I guess the next question is it possible to do that like inline in here in the register column, right? Could I, like, instead of just having like a string, could I actually make it like programmatic, basically?
You would need to pre-process the data before you feed into register column, before you feed it into filter table.
Oh, okay. So I have to extract it in the fetch data area?
That's right.
Okay.
It has to be completely processed before you attach it, install it.
All right. Cool. Thank you.
No problem.
But I guess it's definitely just, at least for these filter tables, it seems like it's a lot more work, like fetching the data and getting it all properly formatted and everything, than like all the rest of it.
I mean, yeah. So I'm not going to argue. It's a pain in the ass, a pain to set it up. But the use case wise, the benefit you're going to see is when you use them to write describe blocks. I mean, the idea is resource building is supposed to be painful. Usually, the more painful the resource building is, the easier the usage of the resource becomes. Like, you expose the data with a lot of processing. So when you go to write the controls, the describe blocks, they're rather trivial because it's just this one liner. Otherwise, if they're not all that, if resource doesn't do a good job exposing data, parsing out data, you're going to have to put that computation on the control side, which is not what you want, because it has to be repeated every single time. And, update, it becomes horrible. So resource allows you to aggregate all your computations, all your complex code into one spot, which is easier to maintain. And, your controls looks pretty and simple. And using these, building the profiles becomes more trivial.
I see. Thanks for the philosophy.
Hey, no pain, no gain.
All right, I just want to check in and see if anybody has any questions, challenges. Anybody need any help with anything? Or does anybody want to demonstrate anything that they've got working?
Sure, I can show my directory thing. So let's see. I loaded in the directory that was passed in here, and I tried to use the file module, sort of piggyback on top of that. So I inherited a couple of specific methods from there to add those onto the directory itself, and then created a filter table to load the contents of this directory with a few different fields there. I prefixed those with file underscore so that they wouldn't get confused with the owner, group, and path of the directory itself. And then here's some examples of using it. I did run into some issues where I think the contents here is broken for binary files or maybe things that are not encoded in UTF-8. So I'm not really sure how to handle that. I think that's purely a Ruby question that I'm just not sure about.
Yeah, but this is very good. I wish there was something like that in the actual file resource.
I was curious about, is it a good idea to return resources as, like, so if here I'm loading the file resource for each item in the directory, would it be reasonable to just return a list of those file resources instead of building up this other structure that sort of picks and chooses bits and pieces of those file resource, fields from those resources?
I think it's more elegant to pick and choose what you need. That's what I think about here. I think I would do the same way you have done.
Okay.
Because your raw data is still going to show everything. So you might be overly busy.
Right.
I mean, it could be something you want or not want.
Okay. So in general, would you say try to avoid having resources composed of other resources?
No, I mean, no, resource composed of other resources is a general pattern in InSpec.
Okay.
It's like the only way to create resources. Like if you boil down every resource you have in InSpec, they all boil down to either file resource or command resource. That's at the core of every single resource you're going to find in InSpec.
All right. I guess I mean, would you want to allow the consumer of your resource to be able to access other resources through your resource?
Oh.
I mean, I understand using resources as building blocks to build up other resources.
I would not. I think this is a gray area, but I would not do it that way. I would, provide data points to be tested against. It's not something that you can convey very easily to the user anyway.
Right.
Expect a file resource as the output of my resource. I would think the computation should happen behind the scenes in the resource itself, and it should expose data points. That's my take on it.
Okay.
Aaron, you might have a different thought.
Yeah, unfortunately, I had a call come in, so I muted you guys just to not interrupt you. What was the thought pattern, just real quickly?
Basically, does it make sense in general to have a resource that then returns references to other resources, to the caller, not just using resources as building blocks. In this case, a bunch of files that build up my resource for a directory. But would it make sense to expose those individual files as resources, as InSpec resources, from my parent resource?
Well, I mean,
and could the caller make use of that, of the fact that these are resources that they could?
Well, I mean, you'd be returning, just like the file resources returns basically an InSpec file object. If you were going to return some sort of struct that had a set of those, right, you'd be returning the file objects again. And from a programming perspective, right, that might make sense, but let's think through kind of what would be the intention of what you were trying to do with this.
Yeah, I guess I'm not totally sure. I'm trying to imagine or trying to leave something flexible for use cases that I haven't imagined. But, in this case of this directory, which holds a bunch of files, I could imagine, the exercise said that there were a few different like owner, group size, contents, and path were the things that we cared about here. But I could imagine maybe some future consumer of this directory resource would want to care about the mode of the files in this directory. And maybe then be able to make use the matchers that be more permissive than. And I'd rather not re-implement all of that here in my directory resource, especially when it's already implemented in the file resource. So would it make sense to return references to the direct to the file resources themselves, so that then the caller could use those?
So what I hear you kind of saying is you're trying to, you're just like we have singular and plural resources, right? For, AWS buckets, right? And bucket. And there's kind of a distinction between the fact of, I'm going to go query the API to return me a set of things. And then once I have those sets, then I can use the individual resource to inspect each of those things. And maybe there's some group functions around that set that I might do, tell me, something about this set, right? How many are there? Do they all have a certain property that makes sense in that context, right? So I think that's kind of where you're going with this.
Yeah.
So you're really talking about making a plural resource for file, right? So you're going to files, right? And then by extension, right, a directory is a specialized kind of file, right? So once you have the files resource, you could then look at basically the abstraction that they did for the directory resource, and then you could have now the directories resource. Not a big deal. That would be kind of where I would go with this. The conversation, we had this conversation a long time ago in the community, and to tell you the truth, I just plain don't remember where we landed on it. It might have been one of those, we'll get to it, it's a good idea, and then got overcome by events. Or maybe we ran into an issue, and I just plain don't remember. So what would we be doing in the files resource? So I guess how we normally develop these kinds of resources, rather than trying to make it so general that people could do almost anything, we would say, well, what are the 3 or 4 basic things that we needed to do, day one? What are the core things we needed to do, right? And then we implement those things. And, then we grow it as we use the resource some more and figure out really what it needs to be doing and stuff like that. Because 9 times out of 10, when you try to guess at what the use case would be for this kind of thing, you probably put a whole lot of work into something that either nobody ever uses, right? And then it just becomes code you have to maintain, that kind of thing. So it's easy to add on, right? So I'd almost start to say, well, what do we want to do with files? Well, the first thing would probably be, for, the files resources at a given path, right? Give me the list of files back, right? And then what would be the next thing that you'd want to do with that? Give me the count, give me the number, maybe, what kind of things are you thinking about? I'd like to be able to iterate over that list, right? And then now I could say, files dot each do blah 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 file, right? That kind of thing.
Sure.
But interestingly enough, right, we kind of have a way to do that, right, with the command resource. And we've actually started to kind of shy away from that, just for speed considerations. Now, this may be less of an issue with Ruby 3 versus Ruby 2, but when we iterated over every single file, and then invoked the file resource on every object, right? There's just plain and simple a heck of a lot of overhead. and it really kills the performance, right? Originally, when we did, let's say, the core check inside the operating system thing, where we say every file in this directory has to be mode 640 or lower, right?
Yeah.
We did that originally with the command resource. Said, give me a list of the files and then invoke the file resource on every one of them. And every time you do that, you're basically creating an object in memory. And your InSpec run became 5.5 gigs real fast because there's a lot of files. Rather than using like xargs, getting only what we cared about, or basically having it say, hey, look, only give me the stuff that doesn't meet these criteria, right? You know, and that kind of thing. So there's some considerations there in terms of, you know, one of the reasons we may not have done a plural files resource was more of a limitation of Ruby and memory, in that we wanted to incentivize a better pattern, you know, and that kind of a thing. So thinking through it, I'm rehashing it all in my head. So, but if you wanted to do a start of a plural files resource, I would probably say, what are the basics of any resource, right? Does it exist? What's the basic set? And then what are a few properties that you want to be able to say, you know, like a filter table of give me all the files that are owned by this user and group. You know, that kind of a thing. Give me all the things that have the sticky bit or don't have the sticky bit. You know, that kind of thing, so that I could say things like, you know, at this path, I expect all files to be owned by root, right? Where I'd want to be able to say in my filter table, give me everything that's not owned by root, and I expect that set to be empty, right? That might be a real convenient way to, you know, do that kind of thing. Because you could use negative logic to, you know,
right,
figure that out. You know, because what I really want to do is pare down my data set as much as possible. And if we have a condition that we're doing some sort of inspection on, where I want to say, I assume everything should be SUID and GUID, blah, 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 right? Or I assume everything in Etsy needs to be group owned by whatever, admin or super cool group, you know, that the organization defined, right? So everybody has read access, but only the right people have read it, you know, yada, 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 that kind of thing. That kind of a thing where I might point it at a file system. What you're really doing is providing a stable interface to find, right? In a lot of ways, to do very smart find commands that you don't want younger admins to try to figure out and kind of half mess up.
Sure.
You know, because half of this language is that, right? Capturing that expertise. How would I do that on Windows? How would I do that on Linux? You know, et cetera. So that would be my thought. But returning that set of objects as file resources inside of a struct, I don't know. I mean, the question really becomes is how would I use that resource? Because if I pared it down to get one of the files or a set of the files, that type of thing, what would I really do? Well, at the end of the day, I'd really have to run it through an iterator and invoke each of those things with the file resource. So returning them as a set of file objects is maybe redundant. I mean, because am I really going to be working with the objects, or will I be working with the paths and then invoking the file resource on that? So kind of think through how you would actually use it. And maybe the problem goes away because you're like, I'd never really do that.
Okay. Yeah, that makes sense.
Okay, so I had to move some things around and I had to start over a few times. So if it looks dizzying and is out of place, that's why. Can you see it?
Yep. Can you please verify the keys in the right location? Can you do ls dash? See that statement after I? The dash dash forward slash inspec.pem?
Here?
Yes.
Inside of your terminal, can you do an ls-al?
Okay. Yes.
Yeah.
But I think it's in the previous directory. Well,
ls space and then -al.
oh, it's in the current directory.
Oh, it is in that current directory. So if you do the up arrow to get your command again, the inspec exec command, just delete the // for the inspec.pem. Yep, right there.
Who did the finger thing? I saw.
Okay, the other thing is you're doing the inspec exec dot, so that's assuming you are already inside of your directory that you're running the profile from. So the only difference is you'd have to change that dot to the actual directory. So let's see, ls-al. It looks like you don't actually have
/day1.
Did you put the where did you put your inspec profile that you're running on right now?
The inspec profile should be in day 2.
It looks like there's nothing in day 2 at the moment.
What's the name of the profile you're writing?
I'm just trying to get back into SSH. Because I had to go all the way back. Because I don't know, I just was moving along, checking on something, and then all of a sudden, everything just kind of stopped working, and I got access denied. So I had to work all the way back to see where the problem started.
So right now, it's just a matter of you're in the wrong directory trying to run these commands. That's what it's coming down to. Because if you look at your day 2 folder in your student 2, there's nothing other than the PEM file and the instructions file. So
right.
First, you'd have to find whatever the profile you're working on. So if you remember what the name of the profile you were writing. Once we get to that folder, then you can go ahead and we can tailor the command to that.
Okay.
Which profile were you working on? Which resource?
I was working on one called Docker 3. So basically Docker and then no space 3. Okay.
And then I'm guessing you did the inspec init profile and then you created Docker 3?
Yeah. So I suppose it's just a matter of finding out where I put it.
Mm-hmm.
So just so I'm not taking up too much bandwidth here. So what needs to happen is I need to find the location of where I put Docker 3, and then I need to put the file address leading to it here.
Yep. Because the dot is just representing that you're going to run whatever's in your current directory, and since there's no inspec in that directory, it can't actually run anything. So you have to find where that is pathing to. And same thing with your -i inspec PEM. You can, if you want to run it directly from where you're at right now, then you can leave it as is. Otherwise, if you want it to change to be in the directory where your inspec is, then you're going to have to change the PEM file location.
Okay. And and also just to be clear, this would be the complete lane or something akin to this, because I think I had some issue with that earlier. That might have played into this. Okay.
Yep, that's how it should be. You're in your student 2 folder and your day 2 folder, and then working through there.
Okay. All right.
If you're able to scroll up through your terminal, you might be able to find wherever you were before.
Yeah. So, I mean, remember, everything in the InSpec command, right, is relative to where you're executing that InSpec command, right? So -I, when it's looking for the PEM file, right, it's relative to whatever directory you're in when you're executing. Just like any other executable.
Right.
So.
All right. I think I can take it from here and work my way back forward. So, thank you for that.
Mm-hmm.
All right. Well, we have hit noon. So I think we're going to let everybody break for lunch.
So we're just continuing on with the section 12 exercise. So if you have any new controls or resources that you've developed that you want to show off, go ahead and let us know. Or if you're having any issues, please let us know as well, and we'll help you debug it.
So I was hoping if I could discuss my solution for the Docker one just a bit.
Okay.
So in this case, it says it's just Docker and it wants singular ID, singular image, so on and so forth, right? And then over here, I managed to get it working after banging my head against the wall for quite a while to figure out how to get that regex working properly. So this is pretty cool how you can actually like set like the variable name in there and then just be able to use like the variable. That's pretty dope. But the thing is, like, I think I got it wrong because I set it up as a filter table and like all of these are plural, right? So like was like the intent of the exercise to get like in individual containers like information, or was this filter table approach correct? Or like is there a way to convert instead of just having like instead of like returning like the actual just like a raw hash or whatever, was like is there like a way to have like a singular like Docker container thing and then I can just return that object as opposed to this pluralized form?
Right. So this kind of falls into the whole the plural singular pattern in InSpec, right? So what you have created is a plural resource that would return properties of containers in a filter table in an array, but you can have the individual. You can have the singular resource that could inspect it in detail. So what you have done is completed the plural, but if you choose to, you can, it would just pass on an ID, which could be taken in by the singular resource, and you can check other properties of the container.
Mm-hmm. Okay. I guess why I took that filter approach method as opposed to just like the singular one, or filter table method as opposed to just a singular one, is it like why would you ask for the ID if the ID was what you would pass in, right, to identify the container in the first place and then do like all the rest of that?
So I would say the suggestion, and this is just a suggestion, right? The suggestion was to just go for the singular resource, but you created the plural resource, both equally bad. You got exercise for the on the capacity of InSpec, and that's what matters here. But yeah, the question looks like it's intended for a singular resource rather than a plural, because it's you're taking in an ID and providing properties of it.
I mean, that was my question, right? Like, is the expectation like even like to like provide the information that you've already provided it? Like, if we feed the IDN, like, why would it still be necessary to access the ID from it, right? Or am I just like seeing things the wrong way?
No, I'll ask Mo to pitch in here because he set up the question. But again, I want to stress that these are not question answers kind of situation. These are just rough lines for you to practice on, and that's exactly what you've done, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, when I put in like suggested things, it's just more to practice as much as possible to query any type of data, and being able to control or create a resource that can do any type of query, really. So it's not much in terms of like the functionality and trying to get this as a working resource, more of just getting as much practice as possible.
See, all right. Thanks for the feedback.
So the plural resource, doing the singular is probably pretty straightforward, right?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, because at least like you can either restrict it, like do basically all this junk, but restrict it on like the fetch data thing to just match against your one ID. But I also think that it's possible to just pass in an ID to Docker, and then it'll give you just like all that information specifically for that one container. So
right. And what you have done in line 29, I didn't know that was possible, and that's awesome. With the regex magic.
I mean, it's definitely magic, man. I've been banging my head against that for like an hour just to be like.
I didn't know that was possible, but yeah. See, I mean, you went above and beyond, and got got just practice on the skill set. Thank you.
Now, the other thing you might want to do on deep for that regex is you might want to wrap that in a %r curly brace, which will kind of protect it from any escapes or, so you don't have to escape things and all that. You could clean up that regex because I see you're doing a lot of escapes of characters and stuff. Ruby actually has a nice little wrapper for regex, so you don't have to dirty up your regex with all that crap.
Oh, okay. I knew it had like that %W thing if you wanted to make like an array or whatever, but I didn't realize it also had an R1 for regex.
Yep. Yeah, lowercase r is regex, and it'll properly escape your regex, all that happy jazz. So you can get rid of all those forward slashes.
Nice.
All right, just checking in. Anybody have any questions, challenges, anything they want to show?
I'll show a little bit I've got. I've been struggling a little bit just due to the lack of Linux and Ruby knowledge. Let me get my screen shared here.
That's okay. That's what we're here for. You guys should be asking us, not sitting there spinning your wheels.
Yeah. Ruby's just a language I never learned. I came from the Windows side of the house, if you will, so I haven't had to venture into Ruby or Perl or Linux, Unix, anything outside of the Windows world. So it's just been a curve, if you will. Okay.
Oh, we'll try not to spoil you too much, knowing you have to go back to Windows.
No, I'm not. I won't be going back to Windows at all. I came to CMS leaving the Windows world of 20 years. So while I've got continuous delivery architecture and DevSecOps and all the like under my belt, I'm in a completely new world, if you will.
Oh, well, whenever you need help, you just reach out.
It. So basically, I just built off of the Git work that I've done from day one, added in a few more bits for just commit log and the tag list, just kind of messing around some. I created a Docker file with a filter table, some fields. Where I ran into a problem was the fetch data, running Docker version and getting the output and parsing it into a key value pair. And then I just said to heck with it after fumbling and hard coded the output that I got from the server over here. And then I wrote some tests based on what I knew was true and what would pass. A Docker do to pull some information from, I ran Git version, not Docker version. There you go. So I basically put this into an array and use that for my data since I couldn't get the Ruby correct to load it properly. And then I jumped down to the harder section here just to goof off some, and I chose this FS tab. And once I started, I then realized that I didn't have to make a library after I'd already started because there's already a resource for etcfs tab. So I pretty much just had to, follow the resource guide on what I was doing and put together a few little checks here based on, again, what I knew was true. And then let's see which one of these I have.
Now, did you find, did you take a look at the actual like etcfs tab resource on the InSpec GitHub as kind of a reference point to maybe kind of learn?
I did not. This was as far as I went. I've been having to answer a few emails as well today, so I apologize for not being able to focus 100%. But this is as far as I went. And basically it was error. I ran it. I got back some, what I was asking for and what was actually true. And then based on that, you can see here where I was working through my errors, and this was kicking my butt pretty good. I think I was passing something null into gsub and it was just barking on gsub, but not knowing Ruby. I struggled with that one for a minute. And you can see I actually still have that error.
Okay.
And I was working my way through. So last test I was on was that was failing, that I was kind of debugging, is the mount options should include defaults. And I think I've got my work here a little wrong. Sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off, Aaron.
Oh, no, not a problem. So let's see, let's go up a little bit to your test. There was only one thing that popped out at me, and this is more of a stylish type thing. So on line 14 there, should not compare to nil. There's actually kind of a built-in thing that you can use that just plain reads a little bit better. So you can say should underbar not be underbar empty or nil. I usually use empty because people know what empty is.
Gotcha.
Right? It equates to the same thing, but it's plain just more readable.
No
Shouldn't
problem.
be empty, right? No, that all looks good. That looks good. That looks good. On point. Got it.
None of it's real heavy or real deep, like some of the other examples I've seen come up. It's all kind of surface level and whatnot. Again, some of my problems were just coming into not knowing Ruby, I think.
All right, so so you were having trouble figuring out how to create basically a hash.
So I wanted to run Docker version and pull this information back into a hash. So that's, you see where I stopped here. I ran my command, got the standard out, and then I was basically struggling on, okay, now that I've got it, what do I do with it next? And that's where, the lack of Ruby knowledge came into play. Well, at least I think I made,
So, there's a couple of ways that you could approach that. Can you get it such that your, so you could basically use the map function along with the split, right? Depending on how that command line comes back. Basically, you could also sedgrep and awk the heck out of that. Right? That's another approach. But the first approach I would look at is, can the command line give you back something that's a little more palatable? You know, is there something in the Docker command line that'll pass you back, you know, a flat text file, or, you know, will it pass a JSON, or, you know, will it return you a JSON, or, you know, some other well-structured thing. So, you know, that kind of thing. So that'd be the first thing that I would look at. You know, that.
Yeah, that's where I was with just kind of fumbling through and digging in and trying to figure out, you know, where to go next. So I hard coded it for sake of time. But
and
yeah,
Roni nicely gave you the command in chat there.
nice. Let me see if I can find
So
it.
Docker version has a -- format command that lets you define the kind of format that you want.
Thank you.
Right. And then once you have, you know, that JSON, so let's take a look at what that looks like. Docker version -- format. There you go. Now, dirty little trick. In your resource, cheat and invoke the JSON resource.
Right.
That knows how to parse that. So if you look in the docs, you'll find a JSON resource that you can go grab. So you can say inspect, you know, blah, blah, blah command equals, right, this string, which is going to be a blob of JSON. And then you can pass that back into the inspect JSON resource by saying, you know, inspect.json.do something. And then you'll have a nice resource that knows how to parse the thing and da-da-da-da-da. Or you could just straight up use Ruby's JSON object, you know, that kind of thing. So, you know, there's two ways to do it. For a resource, I might actually just say use plain old Ruby JSON object, right? So create a new JSON object, and then you'll have all that nice
All right. I'll mess with that.
and then, right, that should be able to give you back, you know, that data in the way you need it. So you're basically just sub-selecting out of there, probably everything from the version down, platform, name, boom, you know, that kind of thing. So that's kind of usually how you approach those types of things. It's just data finagling, right?
Yeah.
Which is really kind of the whole concept of these resources, right? What are we capturing for the end user here, right? Somebody goes through the pain, figures out how to do this once and do it right once, and nobody's mucking it up by everybody trying to refigure out the same problems over and over, right? We're sharing some of that pain. So, cool. Let's see. And you said you were looking at Etsy FS tab and all that. Why don't you hop over quick to the GitHub InSpec repository, and I'll show you guys where to find all the other resources, not just the docs, but the actual code. If you go to github.com/inspec/inspec.
github.com/inspec/inspec.
Should be.
You spelled GitHub incorrectly. It's GTI. That's what you have.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
It's gonna be like, did GitHub get hacked?
Little things.
All right. So then now if you go into lib inspec, resources. All right. So there's Etsy FS tab, and here you go. And now this gives you a great example of maybe some of those Ruby tricks. If you go take a look at the private methods, or, you know, how they're bringing together some of that data.
Will do. Thank you.
And you could look at all the resources that way, and you could learn. This is actually a pretty simple one. It was actually a MITRE intern that actually wrote that at CFS tab one. So.
Excellent. All right. Well, I'll bounce off of my rudimentary and let somebody else share something a little better now. Thank you.
Thank you for sharing.
Wonderful. All right, who's next?
So I tried the hosts allow and also the shadow file. Hosts allow, I think I didn't have any real questions there, but the shadow file, I think I tried a couple of different ways to say if something should or shouldn't be empty. I think I got that figured out here. Basically, I added this custom matcher for empty. It took a bit of figuring out what this should be called. Whether it should be is empty or what, but I figured that out.
Mm-hmm.
The thing that I sort of had the most questions about it. So here on this example, I went and I created a user whose hash algo was MD5 so that it would violate this rule. And that worked. I said it was, oops, I think I messed up. I said it should be empty, ideally. And so it will complain about that being non-empty. But I was thinking it would be probably most useful if it told me who the user was that was violating this rule. Is there an easy way to do something like that? Like I ended up just doing this, its entries should equal an empty array, which then prints out all of this ugliness, which I guess is better than just saying it was expected to be empty, but it wasn't.
Yeah, so we've done that on things like the AWS resources for like S3 bucket and things like that. I guess Roni would probably be the best one to pull that up and kind of show you some of that stuff. And I'm still on my mobile device, so I don't have a keyboard on me.
All right,
well,
should
I do,
stop
but it's
sharing or?
Well, let's take a look at Roni. What are you most comfortable with? Do you want to demonstrate, or do you want to? Because we could actually, you could actually get to your code. So if Roni wants to share and then just kind of use your code as an example, if you don't mind,
Sure, sure,
we can do that.
Okay.
Before I go further, what's the ask? I think I missed the top part of the conversation.
I guess the problem I would like to solve is if I'm asserting that some filter is empty, but it turns out to not be empty. I would like to have some control over a nice way of displaying which things were in there without just dumping the entire struct with all of the fields. In the case of the shadow password file, the username would be a good thing to show there.
Right. And, for some of these things, you might actually find that, a property or a matcher, it doesn't always have to be solved by filter table either. So your resource can be a combination of filter table plus matchers plus properties, and things like that. So we might come to the conclusion that for this particular thing, we might want to do that. And like I just showed for some of these, if you want to, now that you've kind of tried to work through the problem and stuff like that, you might flip to the back of the answer book and kind of take a look at somebody else's implementation to see if that provides any insights about how you could think about it as well.
And actually, all the exercises on section 12 are based off of actual resources that are actually built. So same location that you saw on the GitHub. If you want to look at any of the resources, all of them are implemented there, minus the Git one.
Now, strangely, a Git resource is something nobody has contributed yet. I guess we don't worry about the secure configuration of our source repositories yet.
Exactly.
Whatever. World writable public.
Wasn't there that vulnerability recently about the Git clone and how that was kind of insecure if you weren't on a new version?
Yeah, they had a little bit of a problem there. All right. Well, Roni's looking at that. Anybody else want to show some work? Now that I told all the students all the answers are on the GitHub repository, everybody's digging down to the GitHub repository.
So, Aaron, I think I'm going to share and kind of walk through on the screen. I'm still kind of confused about what the app is. I apologize. So, Patrick, I have your file here. This is the sharded RB. This is the resource you want to.
Yep. Yeah.
Okay. So, what is the describe block you're trying to run? And
so I was, let's see. If you look in the controls folder there, the example down towards the bottom, I had created a user with the hash algo was MD5 so that these three assertions were all failing. I mean, they're all sort of checking the same thing. What I was imagining if this was a real system, I would want to know is who the user is that has this offending password. And so, having, instead of just saying it should be empty, but it wasn't, or the count should be 0, but it was, not 0. And then the entries should be an empty array. We expected an empty array, and instead, it just like printed all of the fields, and it was, I guess the information was there, but I was thinking there might be some nicer way to say it was what the username was.
Right. Let's try this.
And then Shivani also posted a possible kind of similar example.
Yeah, I can paste that link in the chat. So it's for a different system. It's for Windows, not the same resource. But I think the use cases are pretty similar because it's also looking for users that don't comply. And then the result will actually show you the list of the users that, you can look at.
Okay, cool.
Yeah, I'll paste that in the chat.
So you were running on a target, I believe, right?
Yeah, it was 162, whatever, that was the last octet.
Let's see. Just
You have the SSH.
Of course. The joys of typing on screen. Let's see. So would that kind of get you what you need, Patrick? Or more elegantly, I'm saying a user array that matches the hash algo MD5 should be empty. But I got that list of non-compliant user.
Yeah, thanks. That makes sense.
Right. So
As
again,
well. Right.
Right. I mean, this is less elegant, right? I mean, this is where the singular versus plural kind of makes sense, kind of comes into play.
Well, this is where I might suggest we use the expect syntax rather than the should syntax. So I think if Shivani, if you want to walk through that other example.
Sure. Let me just share my screen. So basically, it's just going through and checking what kind of system it is. It runs a command to get some accounts, and it has a failure message. If it doesn't comply, then we get the variable to actually like put on the command line. So this expect syntax will show if it's not empty, then it will show the actual users from that variable on the command line. It's just a different way of doing it, but it's easily readable because sometimes, as you saw, what Roni showed, it can say in an array and this expected to be empty, but you got false. This will just show like a better and cleaner output. That's the only difference.
Cool, that makes sense. Thanks.
So we could update your existing control to kind of match this second block of code and use the expect syntax to see if we could even refine this a little bit more.
So this is using like the RSpec native syntax as opposed to like the InSpec version, right?
Well, InSpec is really wrapping around RSpec. So RSpec has always had the expect syntax and the should syntax. It just depends on what makes the most sense for the statements you're trying to make, right? In what tenor does the words make the most sense? So, yeah, I mean, there are two supported variants, should and expect. Expect is the current default, right? But it's flipped and flopped a few times. So the thing I like about the expect syntax with this kind of iterative sets of data is we can make it a lot more human readable, because then it'll read out account or accounts exist that have no password set, right? You could, even tailor this describe and it statement to read a lot better. So it would say account or accounts exist that have no password set. The accounts that have no password set are blah, right? You could make it like an actual sentence if you really wanted to, which would make it print out and report really cleanly for the assessor, right? So the goal as security engineers, right, that you're trying to get to is to make the output so understandable that the assessor will just read it and not bother you. Right? He won't come back and say, I don't really understand what this is telling me, right? If you can make it report out and read for him when he looks at it in Heimdall, right? Or even the command line, right? Basically clear statements that say, this requirement was met. All accounts have the correct parameters. All the variables in the SSH file are set correctly. It's about as much about communication as it is them really caring what's the magic behind it, right? Which this gives you the power to kind of do that. So let's see. So do we want to go back to your code and see if we can maybe adjust it a little bit? Or, I mean, you found the link, so.
There's also a question on chat, Aaron.
I'm sorry, say it again.
There's a question on chat.
Oh, there is. Singular versus plural if we were talking sheep. Are there known cases where the plural and the singular are the same and how that should be handled? There is an actual PowerShell resource, by the way, where you can properly execute PowerShell in both elevated and non-elevated privilege and all that kind of nice jazz. I mean, if you look at the Windows profiles, you'll see copious uses of the PowerShell resource. And
the PowerShell bit there was separate from the singular versus plural question. Shivani was talking PowerShell, and I was just saying Hearts PowerShell. That I can speak
Right.
all day. But yeah, the question was really around plural and singular. If we're talking about something that such as sheep, which is both the singular and the plural form, I don't know if there's any cases like that, and what somebody may have that they want to check. But if we did come across something where the singular and the plural were the same, is there a known use case for best practice for handling that?
Not that I can think of right off the top of my head.
Okay.
Add
an S.
Basically.
Sheeps. Got it.
Right. Where, it's basically like I'm either talking about a group of these things or one of these things, and it's English, but maybe not that formal. It's computer English. So binary machines like to have things in clean buckets, right? So I can't think of anything where I've run into, that kind of thing. Fundamentally, the plural resource in my mind, right, always returns you some kind of set. So it's either going to return you a list or a hash, right? An array or a hash, or a dictionary, whatever the heck you want to call it. And the singular resources are always going to return you, for the most part, a string of some kind, a data element, or even maybe an array, right? Because it might be a list of stuff, but it's a key value. It's a key value pair of one or more values, usually, or a non-keyed value, aka a string, which the key is the value. And that's really the major difference, right? So that way I can start to filter down, right, a large list into a small list, because eventually I have to get down to a thing needs to be set in a particular way, or all these things have to have a property. And the idea of a plural resource is to just make working with those things a heck of a lot cleaner, right? If I can group the properties of a set into a singular answer, yes or no, it just cleans my code, right? Could I do everything with singular resources? Sure, I can do loops, right? But if I don't have to, that kind of thing. All right, well, we're getting to the last 15 minutes of the class here. So Mo, I was gonna find out if we wanted to go through a little bit of the start of the end material, open it up for the students to ask any questions they might have, or any follow-on type of things.
Yeah, I can rush through the last section real quickly because it's more of just like a FYI type of thing.
And then I'd like to take a minute or two for the students to give us some feedback about what they thought about the class, suggestions they might make, areas they'd like us to cover in more detail, that kind of thing. Is just kind of a feedback type of thing.
All right, so when we were on day one, we talked about local versus built-in resources. If you ever did want to actually take whatever resource you created and actually push it up to the InSpec repository, you can go ahead and fork the repo for InSpec, and we have it linked right here. And then we list out a couple of directories that are important for you. So this is what the directory somewhat looks like for InSpec. What you're going to be wanting to do is you're going to go into the lib inspec resources, as we saw earlier from when Aaron spoke about it, and then you place your actual file right there. That is where the actual resource will go with its logic. The next one that you would need to update is there's this lib inspec, and then there's this resources.rb file. This is a helper file. So whenever you do something like help resources in the shell and it pops up the list of all the capabilities or all the resources available to you, it's actually querying from this file right here. And when you're putting it in, put it in alphabetical order. So for example, if we're using the file resource as an example, it would fit between etc hosts and between file system. Other than that, there are two other files that you need to do are integration tests as well as unit tests. and there are the locations for them. And then finally, in the ERB format, you can go ahead and create the documentation page for it. And to see that in action, this is an example of the IPv6 resource. So this right here is the documentation page, the ERB. Then you have the resources.rb. It was added into there. And then you have the actual resource itself that was built. As you can see, the resource is pretty much the same as what we've been writing so far and what you've seen. And then you have right here the OS prepared. They do have a little bit of a new process where they're now adding cookbooks in to do a lot of the preparation. And the thing that is actually important to know is if you're ever enhancing on any resource or making a new resource that can be built off of a previous one. So in this example, the PR is for IP6 tables, whereas the previous one that was already there is the IP tables. So it was able to just piggyback off of the cookbooks for that. And then the only thing they did was in the recipe list, they just added their own data, like mock data right here for IPv6 compared to what was there before for IPv4. Then you have some of the mock loaders just going ahead and loading in the data. And then you have the integration tests followed by the mock process for it. And then the unit tests.
Right. And a couple other things that I'm not sure we documented, but there is some standardized Rubelcop and what they call chef spec. You know, and there's a process where you can kind of clean your PR and do some reformatting and, you know, all that as part of your submission.
And also
and then,
yeah, go ahead. Sorry.
And then one more thing is they do like you to sign your commits. So when you push up your PR, you have to do like a git commit space -s. You know, so they basically you're attributing that you, Joe Blow, are the one who committed this code, which all that really is at the bottom of your commit message. It puts your name, you know, less than, your email, greater than. You know, and that kind of thing. But that's a DCO sign off. And that's thanks to that whole IBM Linux kernel issue where nobody had signed their commits. And then there was all that legal battle about who owned the code and yada, 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 right? So they're like, we're avoiding that. The lawyers were like, nope, everybody signs their commits. Right.
And then the last thing I'd leave off is when you're creating the PR, you can just call it something like new resource and then followed by the name of the PR. And don't be afraid to just submit it as you're working on it, or if you have, if you're not aware of the full process, because they are very communicative with you in the PR process, and they will go ahead and highlight either areas that could be enhanced, and it's a discussion throughout. And then as you go ahead and fix, it'll be back and forth between you and the InSpec folks until finally it'll either get merged or however they would like to proceed forward with that. Any questions on that? I know I kind of rushed a little bit on it, but we do want to give a little bit of time for people to ask questions overall for the course. All right. I guess back to you, Aaron.
Well, actually, I had a question.
Okay.
How often do people end up writing resources as opposed to just, you know, doing the little bit harder work in a control?
Well, I think just like any other software library, right? If it's a one-off type of a thing where you have to write this code once, but if you find yourself copying and pasting this code or reusing it, right, eventually you're going to say to yourself, I should standardize this into a library because I don't want to write this code anymore. I don't want to have to go fix it in the 10 places I wrote it when I figure out I got to fix something, right? And so we normally encourage people to write a resource if they have to do it more than twice. And, you know, if people have started to borrow from it and all that kind of stuff, you know, once you start to see the pattern of how you develop a resource, we found most people have usually gone that route. I think one of the main reasons is because the InSpec project itself is so disciplined and well structured that building a lot of these things, like the unit test, like the functional test, like the documentation, is so easy to kind of grab something and, you know, just modify it, right? Put it in the right place. You're not like having to do a lot of this work to provide something back to the community. We found people quite often, you know, put resources in, you know, even if they're small, right? Even convenience things, more akin to, you know, just keeping everything within the same style guide. Could you do almost everything with the command resource? Sure, you could. Is that my recommendation? Absolutely not. You know, because there's a reason this resource abstraction layer, right, as you guys have kind of hopefully started to appreciate a little bit, was developed, and so much effort was put into kind of building this pattern of being able to describe the thing I'm inspecting and its properties and its things, and being able to structure this standard language around it, and allow you to report out a lot more cleanly about what the status of things are, where it's broken, how it's broken, what might need to be fixed, all that kind of thing. You know, that's really kind of the, you know, the goal here. So if you find yourself looking at something like, I don't know, Tomcat config, or some new Apache project, or, you know, something like that, the InSpec framework has the ability to say, well, for that new thing, I need a conf resource, a service resource, this resource, a singular and a plural, right? And I understand kind of what those resources should probably expose, what the interface should look like. We have enough of them that you can basically borrow from most of this stuff, and, you know, allow people to just say, hey, describe the new service underbar conf. You know, it's this, it's that, you know, should be there. All the hard stuff in terms of parsing the file, parsing the conf file, grabbing all the key value pairs, all the stuff that you'd have to do, right? There's built-in parsers for that in util, for like parse config file and, you know, all that regex and all that kind of stuff that you'd have to figure out on your own. There's built libraries for that in InSpec. So if you go look at some other conf resource and you'll say, oh, look, it's borrowing from these internal libraries that do this stuff right, regardless of the platform, and it exposes these things. This wouldn't be that hard. Is there any extras that I would like to throw on top of that in terms of properties or matchers, right? I think when Roni and I did the original Java one, you know, we really only had to add like 4 or 5 methods on top of it to answer specific questions that the Java stick wanted, right? It's modules, it's this, it's that. But the bulk of the config file and looking at the file system and, you know, all that kind of stuff, we just borrowed the internal libraries, and that was done in, you know, an hour or two, right? Resource itself didn't take that long to build at all. You know, so that's what I've seen. I've seen people, because they have a nice, clean and well-structured thing and a lot of code they can borrow from, most of the time people just build resources. Now, the other thing that we didn't really talk about in the class, just because well, we can only talk about so much in 2 days, is that InSpec itself has a plugin system that will allow you to develop what's called resource packs. And resource packs are really just profiles that don't have any controls in them. It's just a libraries directory that you can go publish on GitHub, and you can actually tell InSpec to go utilize a resource pack as a plugin and get access to all these resources that may not be in the core, but the community have built up to, provide useful utility, and all that kind of thing. So there are multiple ways you can get these resources that you build out into the world, and that might be another set of course material that we put together and make a doubly advanced class or a different kind of class. But, there's reporter plugins, which Roni could talk about, which are actually fairly powerful. And there's resource plugins that you can write.
Yeah, and just to add to that, I understand that if it's only a few use cases, that writing a resource might seem like it's, you can just put that logic in the control itself. But another good reason to write a resource would be whenever people are creating overlays on any profiles that you have made, if they want to modify any of the data in the control, it's easier for them to handle too. Like if you want to just say, the password requirement, it should be this, and they can just change the number instead of actually understanding all the depths of it. I think that's also easier.
All right. Any other questions? Any other thoughts or suggestions? What did you guys like about the class? What do you think we could have improved? What did you learn most? What was hard to understand? Those types of things. Don't hold back. You won't hurt our feelings. What do you guys feel like we did well?
It was nice being able to go through the issues that I was having, but also follow along as you walked through the issues that other folks were having as well. That was nice.
What do you guys think was the most beneficial part of the advanced class, or even the regular class?
Hey, I actually missed the beginner class, but I think the most beneficial part of the advanced class was getting our own Cloud9 instances to work through this stuff together. I mean, I think that getting to see what other people were struggling with was really helpful. Also, seeing new ways of doing things, that was definitely great.
Yeah, I wasn't able to participate too much today, but yesterday going through and having hands-on creation with resources, and then kind of seconding that, being able to see how everybody else was implementing, and then also comparing that to what's already on GitHub, what things are already available in version control. I thought it was interesting to see how things develop, or how things are developed differently.
So just a question, now that you guys have seen kind of how resources are developed, how the information is created, all that, does it give you a higher level of trust in InSpec or the testing content and even the automated tests and the results that come back? What do you guys think about that?
I mean, for me at least, considering the difficulties I had with getting the data ingestion to work properly, I think I would trust to a certain degree if if something were kind of basic, if everything was done properly. But if it was complicated to any degree, I might go over and take a glance at the InSpec GitHub repo just to maybe just double check to see how they were accessing the various resources, and how I would have gone into and done it manually, right? But that's just that's my take on it.
Oh, absolutely. Completely fair, which is one of the reasons that, we've always strongly, believed that we wanted to be very transparent about how we were getting this information. Let's see. Paul said that he thought Cloud9 worked really well and that the walkthroughs were very helpful. So thank you, Paul. All right, so anything we could have done better or to help make the class more engaging, more productive for you?
Aaron, just a suggestion from my point of view from today. I think it might have been good had we stopped an hour and a half or so sooner and gone through some of these examples from what the teacher might have done as well for the folks that may not have gone through or didn't know how to do some of them. I think that might have been beneficial maybe. I don't know if others think the same, but yeah, I'll leave it at that. Just a suggestion.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, the biggest thing that we struggle with is how much of a Ruby training course do we want to make our advanced class versus an InSpec theory and fundamental, training course, right? How do we balance that?
Understood.
As educators, and it always becomes difficult. I hear your suggestion, and I actually agree with you that maybe during part of this class, one of the things we do is instead of just throwing a big pile of resources at you and saying, go forth and build me resource, we maybe walk through a little bit more of it. And it wouldn't really be that hard for us to do because we'll just borrow from the code that's already there and we know how to read the code, and, all that kind of stuff. And maybe we should make it more clear at the beginning. It's like, if you're struggling, right, go back and use the cheat sheet, right, and self-teach that way. Because in all honesty, right, that's really how I learned a lot of it when I was first starting. On the project, Dominic and Christoph had written a whole bunch of stuff, and I just went and I read over everything. And I said, oh, okay, now I want one that does this. And I went and started writing that one. And then I want one that does this. And I went and started writing that one. And that's really how I learned. So maybe we should take a page out of that. So that's a great suggestion. Thank you. I thank everyone for their time and their attention. And I hope that this has been instructional for you, and that you now have a little more confidence about being able to go and utilize this technology. As always, please never hesitate to reach out to the community via the Slack channels. I will say the Chef community Slack channel for InSpec has got, I don't know, what was it, a couple thousand members last time I looked. So there's no shortage of people that you can go and ask some suggestions with interacting with that community. Always try to bring some example code, right? They like to see that you have tried and failed rather than just saying, how do I do this? Please do be good stewards of reading through the documentation and looking at that. We see multiple questions from multiple beginning users that go, how do I do this? How do I use inputs in InSpec? And I link back, here's the documentation for it. If you have a specific question, please come back. That kind of thing. We have tried very, very hard to make the documentation good with some good working examples and, things like that. So definitely take advantage of the many, many hours of work that the community put into those. Always know that it's a very, very active community. So, don't be shy, engage. And if you have thoughts or suggestions for either the course content or whatever that you don't want to share here, please feel free to email us. Always looking for feedback to try to make it better for the next class. So again, thank you for your time, and thank you so much for your participation.
Also, one more thing to add for the Cloud9 instances, they will be deleted today. So if you'd like to save off your work, just go ahead and right-click your student folder and click the download button. So that way you can get a local copy of your files if you'd like to keep them.
And one more thing that I forgot to mention earlier, if you are a CISSP or you need those cyber credits, for keeping your certifications and, those types of things. Our courses do count, and you can email Eugene to get the certificate of completion for the courses, both of them, and get your, I don't even remember what they're called, CIP credits or CEP credits, that kind of thing. I don't know if anybody remembers what those are off the top of their head, but you do get credit for that as part of your participation in this course.